This is the story of how the greatest empire Runeterra ever knew climbed into the light of the sun and then vanished beneath the sand in a single moment of betrayal. Over the next while, you are going to hear the complete history of Shurima, from the first god warriors who walked its golden halls to the emperor who was murdered at the height of his power, and finally to the day that same emperor rose again from his own tomb. Shurima is a desert now. That is the first thing worth understanding about. What stretches across that region today is sand and ruin and silence, broken only by scattered tribes and a handful of isolated cities that remember almost nothing of what came before them. Underneath all of that emptiness, though, lies the buried body of an empire that once held more power than any kingdom in the history of the world. The sand did not simply cover Shurima, the sand swallowed it whole, and it kept the secret for thousands of years. What follows is a history shaped by three forces that keep returning, no matter how many centuries pass. The first is the sun, and the strange power that the people of Shurima learned to draw down from it. The second is the hunger for that power, the way it lifted ordinary mortals into something close to gods, and then turned several of them into monsters. And the third is betrayal, the quiet kind that grows up inside friendship and trust, the kind that brought the whole empire down in an afternoon. Keep those three threads in mind as we go, because everything that happens to Shurima eventually leads back to one of them. So settle in. We are going to start at the very beginning, with the land itself and the burning thing that hangs above it. This was... Subscribe. No, just kidding. But I am serious. Subscribe. Before there was an empire, there was the desert. And above the desert there was the sun. To most peoples across Runeterra, the sun is simply the sun. A thing that rises and sets and asks nothing of anyone. The Shurimans came to see it very differently. To them, the sun was a source of power that could be reached, gathered, and poured into a living person. And that single belief is the seed from which their entire civilization grew. At the center of that civilization stood the sun disk. The sun disk was an ancient structure built at the heart of the Shuriman capital, and its purpose was to channel the raw power of the sun directly into the world below. It was not decoration, and it was not merely a temple. The disk was a machine of sorts, a device of immense and dangerous capability, and the priests who tended it understood that what flowed through it could either elevate a mortal beyond anything they had been, or destroy them on the spot. That process had a name, and the name was Ascension. Ascension was the ritual that turned a chosen mortal into an ascended being, a creature of near immortal strength and presence that the Shurimans regarded as something close to a living god. The ritual took place at the sun disk, conducted by the priesthood, and the candidate who underwent it was stepping into one of the most perilous moments a person could face. The power that came down through the disk did not flatter anyone. It tested them. Those judged unworthy were not gently turned away. They were consumed by the very force they had hoped to receive, burned out of existence in front of everyone who had gathered to watch. When the ritual worked, though, the result was extraordinary. An ascended being walked away from the sun disk, transformed in body and in nature. Many of them took on the forms of animals, which is why the god warriors of Shurima are remembered with the heads and features of beasts. One of them carried the head of a jackal, another the head of a crocodile, and these forms were not costumes or curses. They were the visible mark of what Ascension had made of them. To look at one of the ascended was to see, immediately, that this was a person who had touched the sun and lived. The empire built itself around these beings. Together they formed what came to be known as the Ascended Host, and the host served as the protectors of Shurima and the spearhead of its armies. Picture what that meant for an ordinary Shuriman of the time. Your civilization was not defended by soldiers alone. It was defended by god warriors who could not easily die, who had been remade by the sun itself, and who fought in the Empire's name across every war it entered. An empire guarded by gods is an empire that begins to believe it cannot fall, and that belief, slowly and invisibly, would become one of the most dangerous things Shurima ever produced. It is worth slowing down here on the relationship between the sun, the disk, and the people, because the whole tragedy of Shurima is written into it from the start. The Shurimans had found a way to reach up and take a piece of something vast and indifferent, and they had learned to use it. That gave them power beyond any rival. It also gave them a constant temptation, because once a society knows that godhood is possible, the question of who deserves it never really goes away. The Sun Disk did not just make god warriors, it made the hunger for them, and that hunger would outlast the Empire itself. For a long stretch of its history, none of this looked like a problem. The Ascended walked among the people, the Sun Disk burned at the center of the capital, and Shurima rose into the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. The Golden Age had begun, and to those living inside it, there was no reason to imagine it would ever end. To understand what Shurima lost, you have to spend time with what Shurima had. And at the top of everything it had stood the Ascended. These were the God Warriors, and two of them in particular tell us almost everything we need to know about what these beings were, and about how even immortality can become a kind of wound. The first is Nasus, remembered as the curator of the sands. Nasus carried the head of a jackal, and his nature was that of a scholar and a guardian rather than a simple soldier. Where you might expect a god warrior to be defined entirely by battle, Nasus was defined by knowledge, by the keeping of records, by a steady and patient mind that valued understanding over conquest. He was, in many ways, the conscience of the Ascended, a being whose enormous power was matched by an even greater restraint. Across the long ages of Shurima, Nasus withdrew from the world for a time, and he would not re-emerge until the empire he had served was already a memory buried under sand. His brother was a very different kind of god warrior. Renekton, the butcher of the sands, carried the head of a crocodile, and where Nasus was a keeper of knowledge, Renekton was a warrior to the core. The two of them stood as brothers in the truest sense, bound together long before the events that would eventually tear them apart. That bond matters, because Renekton's story is not the story of a villain who was always cruel. It is the story of something far sadder, a noble warrior who was broken by what was done to him, and that breaking happened in a place we will return to later, a tomb in which he was sealed for so long that his mind gave way under the weight of the years. Hold on to that pairing, the scholar and the warrior, the brother who slept and the brother who was driven mad. When their paths finally cross again in the present day, the conflict between them is one of the most painful in all of Shurima's history, precisely because it is not a clash between good and evil. It is a clash between two brothers, one of whom no longer recognizes himself. The Ascended were not the only marvels the Empire had. Sharing the deserts of Shurima were the Bracken, a species unlike anything else in the region. The Bracken were crystalline beings, enormous scorpion-like creatures whose bodies were threaded with living crystal, and what made them remarkable was not their size or their strength, but what they carried inside themselves. When a Bracken died, its memories and its very essence were preserved within crystal, which meant that the species as a whole functioned as a living archive. Every Bracken alive carried the accumulated memory of those who had come before it. In a land that would one day forget almost its entire history, the Bracken were, in a sense, the part of Shurima that could not forget. The memory of the ancient world lived on inside them, sealed in crystal, waiting. It is fair to pause and acknowledge that the details of the Bracken and of certain other figures from this era are among the parts of Shuriman history that have shifted over time as the story has been retold and expanded. The broad picture, a crystalline people who store the souls and memories of their dead. Hold steady, and that is the version that matters for understanding the Empire. Put all of this together, and the scale of the Golden Age starts to come into focus. Shurima was a civilization defended by immortal god warriors, organized around a device that could draw the power of the sun into living flesh, and sharing its lands with a species that remembered everything. No rival could match it. No army could stand against the ascended host for long. From the inside, it must have felt less like an empire and more like the natural order of the world, a permanent arrangement that the sun itself had blessed. That feeling of permanence is exactly where the danger lives. An empire that believes itself eternal stops watching for the things that could end it, and Shurima had a great deal that could end it. There were wars waiting on its borders that would tear at the ascended host. There was a corruption waiting inside the god warriors themselves that would turn several of them into something terrible. And there was a single person, close to the very top of the empire, whose hunger for the sun's power had never been satisfied. The Golden Age was real, and it was magnificent, and it was already standing on the edge of a catastrophe that would take everything. We turn now to the first of those catastrophes, a war that began with a rebellion and ended by tearing a hole in the first true crack in the Eternal Empire did not come from a foreign army or a natural disaster. It came from within Shurima's own borders, from a province that the Empire had counted among its own, and the name of that province was Ikathia. Ikathia was a vassal of Shurima, a territory bound into the larger empire, and like many peoples living under the shadow of a far stronger power. The Icathians eventually turned against the ones who ruled them. Rebellion on its own would have been a manageable thing for an empire defended by god warriors. A province in revolt could be met by the ascended host, and the matter would be settled the way Shurima settled most things, with overwhelming and near-divine force. The Icathians understood this perfectly well, and that understanding is what makes their story a tragedy rather than a simple uprising. They knew they could not win a fair war against Shurima, and so they went looking for a weapon that was anything but fair. What they found, and what they chose to unleash, was the Void. The Void is the great hungering nothing that presses against the edges of the world, and the Icathians, in their desperation to overthrow the empire that ruled them, opened a path to it. They believed they were reaching for a weapon they could aim at Shurima. What they had actually done was tear a hole in reality itself, and through that hole came something that did not care about the politics of empire or rebellion, something that wanted only to consume. The war that followed was catastrophic on a scale that Shurima had never faced before. This was not a contest between armies that could be won and then forgotten. The Void did not negotiate, and it did not retreat in any way that lasted. The Empire was forced to commit the Ascended Host to the fight, sending its god warriors into a conflict against an enemy that fought by no rules anyone recognized. Beings who had been remade by the sun, who could not easily die, now found themselves locked in a war against creatures, born from the absence of everything the sun represented. Many of the Ascended were lost in that war, and the cost of holding the Void back carved a wound into the Empire that never fully healed. The creatures that emerged from the Void during and after this catastrophe became some of the most feared things in all of Runeterra, and they traced their origins back to the wound the Icathians opened. The horrors that crawl up out of the deep places of the world, the Devourers and the Watchers and the things that wear the shape of nightmares, all of them are connected to that moment when a rebellious province decided that any weapon was worth using if it meant freedom from Shurima. Even people who later ventured into the Void, who studied it or were swallowed by it, are part of this same long shadow that Ikathia cast over the world. There is one figure from this catastrophe worth lingering on, because his fate captures the helplessness of facing the Void better than any battle could. His name is Zilean. and he was a man who watched his city stand in the path of the Void's hunger. Zilean was no ordinary defender. He reached for time itself, attempting to use the magic of time to save his home from the destruction that was bearing down on it. The result was not salvation. Zilean became unstuck in time, scattered across past and present and future all at once. A man who can see every moment, but can no longer simply live in one of them. He had tried to outrun an unstoppable disaster by stepping outside of time, and the price was that he could never fully step back in. His story is a quieter kind of horror than the war itself, the horror of a person who did everything in his power and still could not stop what was coming. The deeper meaning of Acacia, for the history of Shurima, is that it proved the Empire was not invulnerable after all. For all its god warriors and all its mastery of the sun, Shurima had now stared into something that even its divine champions could barely hold back. The Empire survived Acacia, but it was changed by it. The ascended host had been thinned and scarred. The belief in Shurima's permanence had taken its first real blow, and a kind of darkness had entered the story that would never fully leave. Worse still, the war against the Void had done something to certain of the god warriors that no one fully understood at the time. A slow corruption that would soon give Shurima a new and homegrown nightmare. That nightmare is where we turn next, because some of the Empire's greatest heroes were about to become its most terrible enemies. The Ascended were created to be the guardians of Shurima, the god warriors who stood between the Empire and everything that wished it harm. The most painful chapter in their history is the one in which several of them stopped being guardians at all and became something the Empire had to be saved from. These were the Darkin, and they were not invaders from some other land. The Darkin were Ascended, the Empire's own gods, twisted into monsters. The corruption that produced the Darkin grew out of war and bloodshed, the endless kind, the kind that does not end cleanly and does not let a warrior set down the weight of what they have done. Beings who had been remade to fight, who could not easily die, who were sent into conflict after conflict, including the horror of the Void, were exposed to more violence than any mind was built to carry. Over time, that exposure curdled inside some of them. The nobility that had defined the Ascended gave way to cruelty. The purpose gave way to a hunger for destruction. And god warriors who had once protected the people of Shurima turned that same overwhelming power against everything around them, including their own kind. The Darkin were beings of pure cruelty by the end, and the threat they posed was severe enough that they could not simply be killed in the ordinary sense. Defeating them required something stranger and more permanent. When the Darkin were finally brought down, their essences were not destroyed, but bound, sealed away inside living weapons. The Darkin did not die. They were imprisoned in blades and bows and other instruments of war, conscious and hateful and waiting, trapped inside the very objects that suited their nature. The most famous of them is Aatrox, bound within a sword and remembered by a title that tells you everything about what he became. They call him the World Ender. Aatrox is the Darkin in his most direct and terrifying form, a being whose entire existence has narrowed to a single purpose, the unmaking of everything. To take up the blade that holds Aatrox is not to wield a weapon, it is to be slowly overtaken by the thing inside it. Your body and your will gradually consumed until little of the original wielder remains. The same grim pattern plays out across the other Darkin, each one a prison and a temptation at once. Varus survives as a bow, and his current story is tied to two Ionian hunters named Valmar and Kai, whose lives became fused with the Darkin essence when they took up the weapon. Rast survives as a scythe, locked in a long and quiet war for control with the warrior who carries him, a man named Cain. The two of them sharing one body while each tries to overpower the other. And among the Darkin who have stirred back into the world in more recent times is Naafiri, the Hound of 100 Bites, a Darkin who endured not as a single body but as a pack of warhounds. A single hateful will spread across many forms, reawakening in the deserts of a Shurima that had nearly forgotten such things existed. What makes the Darkin so important to the larger story of Shurima is the way they rhyme with everything else in it. The Empire was built on the idea that mortals could be lifted into something godlike. The Darkin are the proof of what happens when that godlike power meets endless war and is given no limit, no rest, and no purpose beyond destruction. They are the same hunger that built Shurima, turned inward and gone rotten. A civilization that learned to make gods had also, without meaning to, learned to make monsters. And the line between the two turned out to be far thinner than anyone in the Golden Age would have wanted to believe. That thin line is the perfect place to arrive at the heart of this entire history, because the fall of Shurima was not caused by the Void, and it was not caused by the Darkin. It was caused by a single person who stood close to the very top of the Empire, a person whose hunger for the sun's power had been growing his entire life, and who finally found the moment to seize it. Everything we have covered so far, the sun and the disk, the god warriors and the Golden Age, the wound of the Void and the horror of the Darkin, all of it leads to a single afternoon and two men who had known each other since they were young. The fall of Shurima is the center of the entire story, and it is at its core a story about friendship and betrayal. The first of the two men was Azir, the Emperor of Shurima, the last who would rule it at the height of its power. Azir came to the throne at a moment when the Empire was already extraordinary, and his ambition was to make it greater still. He was not a small man with small dreams. Azir intended to leave a mark on Shurima that would outlast every emperor before him, and the way he chose to do it would prove to be both magnificent and fatal. The second man was Xerath, and to understand the fall you have to understand where Xerath began, because he did not begin anywhere near a throne. Xerath was born a slave. That fact sits at the root of everything he becomes, and it is what makes him more than a simple villain. He was clever, far cleverer than the station he had been born into allowed for, and through that cleverness he rose to a place few people of his origin ever reached. Xerath became a magus, a man of real power within the court, and more than that, he became Azir's companion. The two of them had grown up alongside one another, the prince and the slave, and the bond between them was genuine. That is what gives the betrayal its weight. Xerath was not a stranger who slipped a knife into the Empire from outside. He was the Emperor's friend. But friendship did not erase what Xerath was, and it did not satisfy the hunger that his life had planted in him. A man born into slavery, who had climbed higher than anyone expected, and yet remained, in the eyes of the Empire, less than free, carries a particular kind of want. Xerath wanted power, real power, the kind that no one could ever strip away from him, and in Shurima there was only one power that fit that description. He wanted Ascension. He wanted to be lifted into a god warrior, to stand among the immortal and the untouchable, and he wanted it badly enough to wait years for the right moment to take it. The moment came through Azir's own ambition. Azir decided to do something that no emperor before him had ever done. He would undergo the ritual of Ascension himself, uniting in one person the authority of the emperor and the power of a god warrior. This was unprecedented, a fusion of the two highest things Shurima could offer. And Azir believed it would secure both his legacy and the future of his empire. Preparations were made, the priesthood was readied, and the sun disk was prepared to receive him. There is a detail in the lead-up to that day that turns the whole tragedy on its edge. Azir, in his vision for Shurima, intended to free the Empire's slaves. To a ruler, this looked like a great and benevolent act, the kind of thing a man undergoing Ascension might want to be remembered for. To Xerath it was a disaster, because freedom granted to him as a gift was not the freedom he wanted. If Azir freed the slaves, then Xerath's elevation would forever be something handed down by the Emperor's mercy, rather than something Xerath had seized for himself. And worse, it would close off the path to the only prize that mattered to him. Xerath did not want to be a freed slave, standing beside an ascended emperor. He wanted to be ascended, and he wanted no one above him ever again. So Xerath did what he had spent a lifetime learning to do. He manipulated events, he positioned himself at the heart of the ritual, and he waited for the instant when all of that gathered power would be at its most vulnerable. The ritual began at the sun disk, exactly as planned, with the power of the sun pouring down to lift Azir into the ranks of the god warrior. And at the precise moment when that power was at its peak, Xerath struck. He betrayed Azir, and he seized the ascendant power for himself, tearing it away from the Emperor at the very threshold of his transformation. What followed was not a clean theft. The power that came down through the sun disk was never meant to be stolen, and the violence of that moment broke open into a catastrophe that consumed everything around it. Azir was killed. The Emperor who had reached for godhood died at the hands of the friend he trusted most, in the middle of the ritual that was meant to be his greatest triumph, and the destruction did not stop with him. The unleashed, unstable power tore through the capital itself, and the heart of the greatest empire the world had ever seen was destroyed in an instant. The city did not crumble slowly over centuries. It fell in the span of that single ruined ritual, and as it fell, the sands moved in. Shurima, the empire of god warriors and the sun, sank beneath the desert and was swallowed whole. Xerath did not walk away as the god he had dreamed of becoming. The power he had stolen did transform him, but not into a perfect immortal warrior. Xerath became a being of pure arcane energy, a creature of raw magic with no proper body to contain it, and the same forces of the sun disk that he had tried to master turned against him in the end. The magic bound him, sealing his energy inside a stone sarcophagus, trapping the being he had become inside a prison he could not escape. The slave who had reached for absolute freedom ended that day as a thing of pure power locked inside a tomb, and there he would remain. This all happened thousands of years before the present day. The exact count of those years is not something the story fixes with any precision, and it does not need to. What matters is the sheer scale of the silence that followed. An empire that had believed itself eternal was gone in an afternoon, its emperor dead, its capital buried, its great betrayer sealed in stone, and the desert closing over all of it as though it had never been. The golden age was over, and what came next was a darkness that lasted for the better part of recorded history. We turn now to that long silence, and to the thin thread of blood and memory that would, against all odds, survive it. For thousands of years after the fall, Shurima was a grave, the empire that had defended itself with god warriors and drawn its strength from the sun lay buried under the desert. And the desert is patient in a way that almost nothing else is. Sand does not mourn, and it does not remember. It simply moves, grain by grain, year by year, until whatever was beneath it has been smoothed over so completely that you would never guess what once stood there. That is what happened to Shurima. The capital was gone, the sun disk was silent, the ascended host had been scattered and thinned by ages of war and abandonment, and the living world above carried on with only the faintest memory of what had been lost. In the place of the empire there remained scattered tribes and a handful of isolated cities, peoples who lived in the long shadow of a glory they barely understood. To them, the god warriors were legend rather than history. The sun disk was a story, if it was anything at all. Imagine living your whole life walking across the surface of a buried empire, never knowing that beneath your feet lay the bones of the most powerful civilization the world had ever produced. That was the condition of Shurima for an immense stretch of time, a land that had forgotten it was once the center of everything. Yet even in that long silence, two things survived that would eventually matter more than anyone could have known. The first was memory, carried in the crystalline bodies of the Bracken. While the human peoples of Shurima forgot almost everything, the Bracken endured as a living archive, holding the essence and the recollection of an older world sealed safely within crystal. The part of Shurima that could not forget went on existing in the deep places of the desert, waiting, even as the rest of the region lost the thread of its own past. The second thing that survived was blood. Azir had died at the Sun Disk, but the Emperor's bloodline did not end entirely with him. Across the long centuries, that royal lineage thinned and scattered, and very nearly vanished, until it survived in a single living person who had no real idea what she carried in her veins. Her name was Sivir. Sivir was a battle mistress, a mercenary who made her way through the world by skill and by force, rather than by any claim to ancient royalty. She wielded a distinctive jeweled crossblade, and she lived the hard and practical life of someone who sells her abilities to whoever can pay for them. There was nothing in the way she lived to suggest that the last drop of an imperial bloodline ran through her, that she was the final descendant of the Emperor who had reached for godhood and been murdered for. The royal blood of Shurima had ended up in the hands of a sellsword who knew nothing of the empire it came from. And that quiet irony is one of the most beautiful things in the whole story. The key to resurrecting the greatest emperor in the history of the world was walking around in the body of a mercenary who had no idea she was holding. Around this same modern moment, another figure had become tangled in the ruins of Shurima, and her story is a warning about what the buried empire could do to those who came hunting its power. Her name was Cassiopeia, and she did not come from Shurima at all. Cassiopeia was a noble, a daughter of the influential House de Cateau, and she belonged to the world of intrigue and ambition rather than the world of desert legend. What drew her to Shurima was the same thing that had doomed so many before her, the lure of ancient power waiting in forgotten tombs. Cassiopeia ventured into one of those Shuriman tombs in search of that power, and the tomb did not give her what she wanted. Instead, it changed her. Something within that ancient place cursed her, transforming her body into that of a serpentine creature, half woman and half snake, beautiful and venomous, and no longer entirely human. The empire that had once lifted mortals into gods now in its ruined state, twisted an ambitious noble into a monster of a different kind. Cassiopeia survived her transformation, but she emerged from that tomb as something other than what she had been, and her hunger for power did not fade with the change. If anything, it sharpened. These were the threads, then, that the long silence had left behind, memory held in crystal, royal blood carried unknowingly by a mercenary, and an ambitious, cursed noble who still craved the power buried in the sands. For thousands of years, none of it had come together. The empire had stayed buried. The emperor had stayed dead. The betrayer had stayed sealed in his sarcophagus, and the maddened warrior had stayed locked in his tomb. All of that was about to change, because the three surviving threads were about to be pulled into a single place at a single time, deep beneath the desert, in the chamber where the emperors of Shurima had been laid to rest. The Empire of Shurima had been waiting thousands of years for a particular combination of things to occur in a particular place, and the place was the tomb of the emperors. This is where the long silence finally breaks, where the dead emperor and the unknowing heir and the cursed noble all converge, and where the history of Shurima stops being a story about the past and becomes, once again, a story about the future. Cassiopeia was the one who set it all in motion, though not in the way she intended. Still hungering for the power locked away in the ancient ruins, she turned her attention to the tomb of the emperors, one of the most significant sites left from the buried empire. To reach what she wanted, she needed Severe, and she brought the mercenary along with her into the depths of the tomb. From Cassiopeia's point of view, Severe was a means to an end, a tool to be used and then discarded. She had no loyalty to the woman who carried Azir's blood, and she had no intention of letting Severe share in whatever power the tomb might yield. Deep inside that tomb, Cassiopeia turned on her. She betrayed Severe and struck her down, wounding her so badly that the mercenary's life began to drain away on the ancient stone. This was meant to be the end of Severe, one more body left behind by an ambitious noble in pursuit of power, the kind of casual betrayal that Cassiopeia had likely committed before. But Cassiopeia did not understand what she was actually doing. She thought she was killing a hired sword. What she was really doing was spilling the last royal blood of Shurima onto the very ground where the Empire's power still slept. The blood of Azir's bloodline, poured out within the tomb of the Emperors, was the missing piece the Empire had been waiting for across all those silent centuries. As Severe's royal blood met the ancient power of that place, the ritual that had been violently interrupted thousands of years before finally found a way to complete itself. The ascension that Xerath had stolen from Azir at the moment of his death began, at last, to happen. Azir rose. The Emperor who had been murdered at the Sun Disk returned, and this time the power did not betray him. Azir completed the transformation that had been torn away from him in the instant of his death, ascending into the god warrior he had reached for all those ages ago. He did not return as a vengeful wraith or a hollow echo of the man he had been. He returned as the ascended emperor he was always meant to become, and one of the first things he did with that restored power speaks to who Azir was at his core. He healed Severe. There is something deeply fitting in that moment. Severe was dying, betrayed and abandoned. Her blood the very thing that had brought Azir back. The Emperor, newly risen and immensely powerful, chose to save the descendant who had unknowingly carried his bloodline through thousands of years of silence. The last of Azir's line had given him his life back, and Azir, in turn, gave hers back to her. Two people separated by an unimaginable gulf of time were bound together in that chamber. The ancient emperor and the modern mercenary, each one owing their continued existence to the other. But the resurrection of Azir was not the only thing that woke in the tomb of the emperors. That same tomb had been a prison, and the rising of the emperor shook loose what had been locked away inside it. Renekton, the crocodile-headed god warrior, the butcher of the sands, had been sealed within that tomb for an unthinkable span of time, and he had not been alone. He had been imprisoned alongside Xerath, the very being whose betrayal had brought the Empire down. Picture what that imprisonment must have been. A noble warrior, one of the great ascended of Shurima, locked in darkness for thousands of years in the company of the Empire's greatest traitor. The mind is not built to survive that, and Renekton's did not survive it intact. When he burst free from the tomb, he came out maddened, his reason shattered by the endless centuries of confinement, his rage the only thing left burning clearly inside him. And Xerath, too, was freed. The being of pure arcane energy who had been bound inside a stone sarcophagus since the fall of Shurima was loosed from his long imprisonment. The traitor was back in the world, his hunger for power undiminished by the ages, free once more to pursue the godhood he had murdered an empire to obtain. Everything that the fall of Shurima had buried, the emperor, the warrior, and the betrayer, had now come back into the light at very nearly the same moment. With Azir risen, the empire itself began to stir. The ascended emperor set about doing what no one had imagined possible, raising the ancient city from beneath the sands and beginning the work of restoring Shurima. The grave was opening. The buried empire that had been smoothed over by thousands of years of patient desert was being called back up into the daylight by the very emperor whose death had buried it. Shurima was rising again, and the modern world, which had treated the Empire as little more than legend, now had to contend with the return of something it had never truly believed in. This is the point where the ancient history of Shurima becomes the living present of Runeterra, and where the old wounds reopen in new forms. The most painful of those wounds is the one between two brothers, and it deserves a chapter of its own. Among everything that the rising of Shurima brought back into the world, the most heartbreaking is not the betrayer Xerath or the buried city, or even the resurrected emperor. It is the broken relationship between two brothers who had once stood together as god warriors, and who now stand against each other for reasons that neither of them ever truly chose. Nasus and Renekton were brothers among the Ascended. We met them in the Golden Age, the jackal-headed scholar and the crocodile-headed warrior, two beings who had been lifted into godhood and who shared a bond that ran deeper than any title. Nasus was the keeper of knowledge, the patient and restrained one, the conscience of the Ascended. Renekton was the warrior, fierce and direct, a god warrior in the most literal sense. Different as they were bound to one another, and in the height of the Empire their differences complemented rather than divided them. What broke that bond was not anger or rivalry, or any of the ordinary things that turn brothers into enemies. What broke it was the tomb. Renekton was sealed away within the tomb of the emperors, imprisoned alongside Xerath for a span of time that defies imagination. Thousands of years in darkness, with the Empire's greatest traitor for company. No mind, however strong, is built to endure that kind of confinement. The Renekton who eventually burst free from the tomb was no longer the noble warrior who had been sealed inside it. The endless centuries had hollowed him out and filled the empty space with madness and rage, and the brother that Nasus had known was, in a terrible sense, no longer there. This is what makes the conflict between them so painful to follow. When the two brothers clash now, it is not a battle between a hero and a villain. Renekton is not evil in the way the Darkin are evil, twisted by their own hunger for destruction. Renekton is a victim, a great warrior who is broken by an unjust imprisonment, lashing out through a fog of madness that he cannot see his way out of. And Nasus, the patient scholar, is left to face a brother who no longer recognizes, forced into conflict with the person he was once closest to in all the world. There is no clean resolution available to either of them. Nasus cannot simply defeat the madness, and Renekton cannot simply reach back through it to the brother he used to be. The tragedy of Nasus and Renekton is, in a way, the tragedy of all of Shurima, written small. The Empire took beings of great nobility and put them through more than any nobility could withstand. It made gods, and then subjected them to imprisonment and war and betrayal, until some of them broke. Renekton's madness is personal and specific, the result of one tomb and one cruel span of years, but it rhymes with the larger pattern that runs through the whole history. Shurima was a place where greatness and ruin were never far apart, where the same forces that lifted a being to the heights could just as easily shatter them, and the sight of two brothers locked in a fight that neither of them wanted is that whole truth distilled into a single, sorrowful image. When you watch Nasus and Renekton now, in the rising Shurima of the present day, you are watching the long reach of the fall. The betrayal at the Sun Disk did not only kill an emperor and bury a city, it set in motion the imprisonment that would one day drive a noble warrior mad, and it ensured that when the Empire finally rose again, one of its first stories would be the grief of a brother facing a brother he can no longer save. That is the kind of wound that Shurima specializes, the kind that takes thousands of years to fully open. We have followed the Empire from its golden age, through its fall, and into its rising. Now it is time to look at the Shurima of the present, at the people who live in the shadow of the returning Empire, and at the way this whole history is, even now, still being written. The empire is rising again, but Shurima was never only its emperors and its god warriors. Across the long silence and into the present day, the desert has remained home to living people, to nomadic tribes and isolated cities and individuals whose stories are woven into the larger fate of the region. To understand what Shurima is now and what it might become, you have to spend time with the people who walk its sands today, the ones who will inherit whatever the returning empire brings. The first of them is Talia, a young stone mage who came up among the nomadic tribes of Shurima. Talia's gift is the ability to shape and command stone and earth, to weave the very ground of the desert to her will, and that gift set her apart from a young age. Her story follows a shape that anyone who has left home and come back will recognize. She traveled away from her people and out into the wider world, learning and growing far from the tribes that had raised her. And then, she returned to Shurima to find that her homeland and the people she loved were under threat. Talia represents something hopeful in the history of Shurima, a member of the living desert peoples whose power comes not from the sun disk or from Ascension, but from the land itself. A Shuriman whose strength is rooted in the ground beneath her rather than the burning thing above it. From the cities of Shurima comes another figure, a warrior named Cassante, who hails from the city-state of Nazuma. Cassante is a hunter, a defender of his people against the dangerous creatures that threaten them, and he carries the pride of his city in everything he does. The presence of a city like Nazuma, with its own warriors and its own way of life, is a reminder that Shurima in the present is not a single unified empire, but a scattered collection of communities, each with its own identity, each carrying on in the long aftermath of the fall. Cassante is a more recent addition to the broader story of Shurima, and his existence shows that the region is still being filled in, still gaining new faces and new corners that earlier tellings of its history had left blank. Then there are the older powers, the things that slept through the long silence and are now stirring back to life as the Empire. Among them is Naafiri, one of the Darkin, who endured across the ages not as a single broken body, but as a pack of warhounds. A single hateful will spread across many forms. Naafiri reawakened in the deserts of a Shurima that had nearly forgotten the Darkin existed. A reminder that the corruption born from the Empire's ancient wars never truly went away. It only waited, the way so much in Shurima waits, for the conditions that would call it back. The return of a Darkin to the rising Empire is a sign that the old dangers are reawakening alongside the old glories, that you cannot raise the buried past without raising its monsters along with its marvels. The Bracken, too, remain part of the living desert. These crystalline beings, the great scorpion-like creatures who carry the memories and the essence of their dead within crystal, are the part of Shurima that never forgot. While the human peoples lost the thread of their own history, the Bracken held onto an older world inside themselves, sealed safe in crystal through all the silent century. Their nature has been told and retold over time, and the version that endures is the one that matters most for understanding them. A people who are, in a real sense, the living memory of ancient Shurima. As the Empire rises, the Bracken represent a bridge between what Shurima was and what it is becoming, a connection to the deep past that survived precisely because it could not be buried in the way a city could. There are figures in the Shuriman desert whose stories are deliberately wrapped in mystery, and it is worth being honest about them rather than pretending to a certainty that does not exist. One is Rammus, a strange armored being of the deserts whose true origins are intentionally left unclear, a figure surrounded by rumor and legend rather than settled fact. The mystery is the point with Rammus, and the most accurate thing to say is simply that he belongs to the desert and that no single account of where he came from has ever been treated as the final word. Another is Amumu, a sorrowful, mummified figure connected in some tellings to the ancient world of Shurima, a cursed child or lost prince from an age-long past. Amumu's story exists in more than one version, and rather than choosing one and declaring it true, the honest approach is to recognize that his origins live in legend, told different ways in different times, which is itself a fitting fate for a figure so tied to grief and forgetting. What all of these people and beings share is that they are living in a moment of profound change. For thousands of years, Shurima was a settled question, a buried empire and a scattered people, and a long, unbroken silence. Now the Emperor has risen, the city is climbing back out of the sand, the Darkin are stirring, and the betrayer is loose in the world once more. The tribes and the cities and the ancient sleepers of the desert are all being pulled into the orbit of a returning empire, and not one of them can be certain what that return will mean. Shurima's present is a held breath, a region poised between its buried past and an uncertain future, with its people caught in the middle of the largest change their land has seen since the day the sands closed over the capital. There is one more thing worth understanding about the complete history of Shurima, and it is something that sets a story like this apart from the history of any real and finished civilization. The history of Shurima is not closed. It is still being written, still growing, still being expanded and revisited, and occasionally reshaped. And that ongoing quality is part of what makes it the kind of story people return to again and again. The Shurima we have been describing, with its sun disk and its ascension, its emperor Azir and its betrayer Xerath, its fall and its rising, took the shape we know it in through a major effort to develop and deepen the lore of the region. The buried empire was brought into focus, its central tragedy was given its emotional weight, and the pieces that had existed in scattered form were drawn together into the coherent history that fans know today. Before that effort, the picture of Shurima was different and far less complete, and the version most people think of when they think of the Desert Empire is the one that emerged from that deeper development. Since then, Shurima has continued to grow. New figures have been added to its sands over time, like the warrior Cassante of Nazuma and the reawakened Darkin Narfiri, each one filling in a part of the map that had been blank before. Older figures have been revisited and retold, their stories deepened or reshaped to fit the larger picture, as happened with the crystalline Bracken. This is why someone who loves the lore of Shurima can keep finding new things in it. The history is alive in a way that a finished history can never be, because the people who tend it keep adding to the Empire's story, keep raising new corners of it out of the sand the way Azir raised the city. That living quality also means that the history carries a few honest uncertainties, and a story told well does not hide them. There are figures whose origins are deliberately left mysterious, like Rammus, and figures whose stories exist in more than one version, like Amumu. There are details that have shifted as the lore has been retold, and parts of the picture that remain open to interpretation and to fan debate. The relationships between the great forces of the region, the Ascended and the Darkin and the Void, the way they connect and the order in which things happened, are the kind of thing that the people who love this lore discuss and argue over with real passion. Rather than papering over those open questions, it is better to acknowledge them, because they are part of what makes the lore engaging. A history with a few honest gaps invites you in. It gives you something to wonder about, something to fill in with your own imagination, something to keep turning over long after the telling is done. The current state of Shurima, as the story stands now, is a kind of beginning rather than an ending. The Empire is rising again under a resurrected Azir. The buried city is climbing back into the daylight. Xerath, the betrayer, is free once more and pursuing the power that has always driven him. Renekton is loose and maddened, locked in tragedy with his brother Nasus. The Darkin are stirring, the living peoples of the desert are being pulled into the wake of the returning empire, and the long silence that lasted thousands of years has finally been broken. Where all of this leads is not yet settled, which is exactly what you would expect from a history that is still being written. The grave has opened, and what comes out of it is a story that has not finished telling itself. For someone who loves this world, that is the best possible place to be left. Shurima is not a museum piece, a dead empire to be admired from a safe distance. It is a living thread in the larger fabric of Runeterra, one that keeps moving forward, one that keeps surprising the people who follow it. The complete history of Shurima, in the truest sense, can only ever be complete up to the present moment, because the Empire's story is still climbing out of the sand even now. We come, at last, back to where we began. Before we draw all of this to a close, it is worth returning to the thing that started everything, the sun, and sitting with it. The whole history of Shurima begins with a single decision that the people of that land made long ago. The decision to treat the sun not as a distant and untouchable thing, but as a source of power that could be reached and used. Everything that follows, every triumph and every catastrophe, grows out of that one choice, and it rewards a slower look. Think about what it means for a civilization to believe that godhood is achievable. For most peoples across the world, the line between mortal and divine is absolute, a wall that no one crosses. The Shurimans did not live behind that. They had the sun disk, and the sun disk proved, again and again, that a mortal could step into the ritual of Ascension and walk away as something close to a god. That knowledge changes a society at its very foundation. It means that greatness is not only inherited or imagined, but built, drawn down from the sky through a device of their own making, and poured into the bodies of those judged worthy to receive it. The priesthood that tended the sun disk carried an enormous burden because of this. They were not merely the keepers of a temple, they were the gatekeepers of godhood itself, the ones who oversaw the moment when a mortal stepped forward to be transformed or destroyed. There is no heavier responsibility imaginable than standing at the threshold where a person either becomes a god or is consumed by the attempt, and the Shuriman priests stood at that threshold as a matter of duty. Every ascension was a moment of terrible weight, a gamble with a life and with the power of the sun, conducted in front of a people who understood exactly what was at stake. And the danger was always real, which is something easy to forget when you only picture the god warriors in their finished glory. The power that came down through the sun disk did not lift everyone who reached for it. The unworthy were consumed, burned out of existence by the very force they had hoped would elevate them. Picture the courage, or perhaps the desperation, it would take to step into that ritual, knowing that the sun itself would judge you, and that a judgment against you meant not failure, but death. The Ascended were not simply lucky. They were the ones who had passed through a trial that destroyed those who could not endure it, and that origin is part of why they carried such presence. Every god warrior of Shurima was, in a sense, a survivor of the sun's judgment. This is also where the deepest danger of Shurima hides, and it is a danger of the spirit rather than the body. Once a society knows that godhood can be seized, the question of who deserves it never goes quiet. The sun disk did not only produce god warriors, it produced longing. It produced the constant, gnawing awareness that the highest possible power was right there, real and reachable, waiting for whoever could claim it. For most Shurimans, that longing stayed in check, bounded by the priesthood and the rituals and the order of the empire. But longing of that kind does not disappear simply because it is bounded. It waits, the way so much in Shurima waits, for someone with enough hunger and enough cleverness to find a way around the rules. That is the weight of the sun, and it is a double weight. On one side, the sun gave Shurima its glory, its god warriors, its place as the greatest empire the world had ever known. On the other side, the sun planted in that same empire a hunger that could never be fully satisfied, a temptation toward godhood that would eventually find its way into the heart of the one person positioned to bring everything down. The sun gave Shurima everything, and in giving it, the sun also handed the empire the seed of its own destruction. The brightness and the ruin came from the same source, which is perhaps the truest thing that can be said about the whole history of the Desert Empire. If the sun is the source of Shurima's story, then Xerath is its sharpest edge, and he deserves a closer look than a simple label as the villain who brought the empire down. The betrayal at the Sun Disk was the single most consequential act in all of Shuriman history, and the man who committed it was far more complicated than the word traitor allows. To understand the fall, you have to understand the shape of the person who caused it, and that shape was carved by something that came long before any thought of betrayal entered his mind. Xerath began as a slave. That is the fact that everything else grows out of, and it is impossible to think about him honestly without holding it at the center. He was not born to power. He was born owned, his life and his labor belonging to others, his future bounded by a station that the Empire had assigned to him before he could speak. For most people born into that condition, the ceiling never lifts. Xerath was not most people. He was extraordinarily clever, and through that cleverness he did something almost no one in his position ever managed. He rose. He became a magus, a figure of genuine power and learning within the court, and he became the companion of a prince. The slave climbed nearly to the top of the world that had owned him. But here is the part of Xerath that turns him from a villain into a tragedy. Climbing nearly to the top was not the same as being free, and it was not the same as being equal. No matter how high Xerath rose, the Empire still saw him through the lens of where he had begun. He could stand beside the Emperor as a friend and an advisor, and he could still remain, in the eyes of Shurima, something less than the men he stood beside. That is a particular and bitter kind of suffering, to come so close to the summit and to feel the invisible line that says you may approach but never truly arrive. The hunger that grew in Xerath was not a simple greed for more. It was the hunger of a person who had been told his whole life that he was less, and who had decided that the only way to escape that judgment forever was to become something that no one could ever look down on again. This is why Azir's plan to free the slaves struck Xerath the way it did. To almost anyone watching, the Emperor's intention to grant freedom looked like generosity, like the noble gesture of a great ruler. To Xerath, it was the opposite of what he wanted, and understanding why is the key to understanding the whole betrayal. Freedom handed down as a gift from the Emperor would have made Xerath's elevation an act of Azir's mercy. It would have meant that even his liberty was something given to him by a man standing above him. One more thing he owed to the order that had owned him. Xerath did not want to be a freed slave grateful to his master. He wanted to seize, by his own will and his own design, a power so absolute that the question of his origin would never matter again. He did not want to be lifted. He wanted to rise on his own terms, with no one above him, ever. So the betrayal was not a sudden act of madness, or a simple grab for treasure. It was the culmination of a lifetime, the final move in a long game, played by a man who had spent his entire existence learning how to navigate a world that refused to fully accept him. Xerath positioned himself at the heart of the ritual. He waited for the instant when the power of the sun was at its most vulnerable, and he took it. In that single moment, the slave who had been told he was less reached up and tried to make himself the most powerful being in the world. And the cruelty of his fate is that it gave him exactly enough of what he wanted to make his failure unbearable. Xerath did become more than mortal. The power transformed him into a being of pure arcane energy, a creature of raw magic beyond anything an ordinary person could be. But he did not become the perfect god he had imagined, and the very forces he had tried to master turned and bound him, sealing his energy inside a stone sarcophagus. The slave who had reached for absolute freedom ended that day more trapped than he had ever been, locked alone in a prison of stone for thousands of years. He had spent his life refusing to be contained by the station he was born into, and he ended it contained more completely than any chain could have managed. There is a terrible symmetry in the kind of symmetry that the history of Shurima seems to produce again and again, where the thing a person reaches for hardest becomes the exact shape of their ruin. For all the drama of the fall and the rising, there is a quieter character in the history of Shurima that runs underneath all of it. And that character is time. Thousands of years passed between the betrayal at the sun disk and the resurrection of Azir, and that immense stretch of silence is not just empty space between two exciting events. It is a presence in its own right, and slowing down to feel the weight of it changes the way the whole story lands. Consider how long that silence actually was. The Empire fell in a single afternoon, but the burial lasted for an age. Generation after generation of Shurimans lived and died on the surface of a forgotten empire, never knowing what lay beneath them, never suspecting that the legends they half-remembered had once been the most powerful civilization in the world. The sand did its patient work the whole time, smoothing over the ruins, erasing the edges, turning history into rumor, and rumor into nothing. Sand is the great forgetter. It does not destroy in a violent rush, the way fire or flood might. It simply accumulates, indifferent and unhurried, until what was beneath it has been swallowed so gently and so completely that no one can find the seam where the past was buried. Against that patient forgetting, two things held on, and the fact that they held on at all is something close to a miracle. The first was memory, kept alive in the crystalline bodies of the Bracken. While the surface peoples forgot everything, the Bracken endured as a living archive, carrying the essence and the recollection of an older world, sealed safe within crystal. There is something profound in the idea that the memory of ancient Shurima survived not in any human record, not in any monument or text, but inside the bodies of a species of crystalline desert creatures. The part of the Empire that could not be buried was the part that lived inside beings the surface world barely understood. Memory found a vessel that the sand could not reach, and it waited there through the entire long silence. The second thing that held on was blood, and its survival is even more improbable than the survival of memory. Azir's royal bloodline did not end with his death at the sun disk. Against every reasonable expectation, that lineage threaded its way down through thousands of years, thinning and scattering, until it survived in a single living person who knew nothing of what she carried. Think about how fragile that thread was. Across all those centuries, the line could have ended 1,000 times over, in war or famine or simple chance, and the resurrection of Azir would have become forever impossible. Instead, the blood survived, carried unknowingly by a mercenary named Severe, who lived an ordinary hard life with no idea that the fate of an empire was sleeping in her veins. The patience of sand erased almost everything, but it could not erase that single fragile thread. And in the end, that thread was enough to undo thousands of years of burial in a single moment. There is a kind of consolation hidden in all of this, and it is worth naming. The history of Shurima could easily be read as a story about loss, about a great empire swallowed by an indifferent desert and forgotten by the world it once ruled. But the survival of memory in the Bracken and of blood in Sivir tells a different and gentler truth. Some things outlast even the patience of sand. Some things are too deep to be fully buried. The empire was forgotten, but it was not erased, and the proof of that is the day the city climbed back out of the desert at the call of an emperor who had been dead for thousands of years. Time buried Shurima, and time, in its own slow way, also kept the keys to bringing it back. That is perhaps the most peaceful thought to hold on to as we move toward the end of this story. The desert is patient, but so are the things that refuse to be forgotten. For thousands of years, the Empire waited, and the waiting was not truly empty. It was the long, quiet keeping of a promise that the sand could cover Shurima, but could never quite make it disappear. We have spent a great deal of this story marveling at the Ascended, the god warriors who were the glory of Shurima, and that admiration is deserved. But there is a darker truth woven through the existence of these beings, and it is one of the most quietly tragic threads in the entire history of the Empire. To be Ascended was to receive a gift of near immortality, and near immortality, it turns out, carries a cost that no one in the Golden Age seemed to fully reckon with. The god warriors were built to endure almost anything, and the terrible irony is that being built to endure meant they could be made to suffer in ways that would have been mercifully impossible for an ordinary mortal. Begin with the Darkin, because they are the clearest expression of this cost. The Darkin were not created as monsters. They were Ascended, the Empire's own god warriors. And what turned them was not some external evil but war itself, endless war, the kind that does not stop and does not allow a warrior to ever set down the weight of what they have done. A mortal soldier, however hardened, eventually dies, and death sets a limit on how much horror one being can absorb. The Ascended had no such limit. They could not easily die, which meant they could be sent into conflict after conflict, exposed to more bloodshed than any mind was ever built to carry, with no natural end to release them. Over time, in some of them, that endless exposure curdled. The nobility wore away, the purpose twisted, and beings who had been protectors became creatures of pure cruelty. The Darkin are what happens when you give something the capacity to endure forever, and then subject it to more than any soul should ever have to endure. That is a chilling reframing of immortality. We tend to imagine living forever as a blessing, an escape from the one fate that frightens us most. The history of Shurima suggests the opposite, that to live forever in a world full of war and betrayal is to be trapped in your suffering with no door out. The Darkin could not die their way free of what was being done to them, and so the only escape their broken minds could find was to become the very thing that was destroying them. They turned their endless endurance into endless cruelty, and even when they were finally defeated, they could not be killed. They could only be bound, sealed inside living weapons, conscious and hateful and trapped, which is simply imprisonment standing in for a death that was never available to them in the first place. The same cruel logic reaches all the way to Renekton, and his fate may be the most personal and the most painful illustration of the whole. Renekton was not corrupted by war into a Darkin. His ruin was quieter, and in some ways even sadder. He was sealed inside the tomb of the emperors, imprisoned for thousands of years alongside the Empire's greatest traitor. And the thing that broke him was not violence, but time and confinement. Here again, immortality is the trap rather than the gift. A mortal locked in that tomb would have died within years, and death, terrible as it is, would have been an end to the suffering. Renekton could not die. He was built to endure, and so he endured, conscious, in darkness, for a span of time that no mind can survive intact. When he finally burst free, the warrior was gone, and only the madness remained. He had been given the capacity to live forever, and that capacity became the instrument of an almost unimaginable torment. Set against all of this is Nasus, and his story offers the other side of the same coin. Nasus too is near immortal, and Nasus too has had to watch the ages pass and carry the weight of everything he has seen. But where Renekton was broken and the Darkin were corrupted, Nasus endured with his nobility intact, a patient scholar who used his long existence to preserve knowledge rather than to spread ruin. The difference between Nasus and his brother is not a difference in their nature at the start. It is a difference in what was done to them. Renekton was thrown into a tomb for thousands of years, and Nasus was not. The same gift of endless life produced a keeper of wisdom in one brother and a maddened wreck in the other. And the only variable that separated those two fates was suffering. That is the cost of living forever, laid bare in the form of two brothers who began as equals and ended as a scholar and a madman, forced to face one another across a gulf that neither of them chose to create. When you hold the Ascended in your mind now, hold this alongside the wonder. They were magnificent, and they were also, many of them, deeply wounded by the very thing that made them magnificent. The sun lifted them beyond mortality, and beyond mortality there was no death to release them from whatever the Empire's endless wars and betrayals chose to inflict. The glory of the God Warriors and the tragedy of the God Warriors are the same story told from two angles, and the history of Shurima refuses to let you have one without the other. Having sat with the deeper currents of this history, the weight of the sun, the shape of the betrayer, the patience of sand, and the cost of living forever, it helps to walk the whole arc of Shurima one more time, slowly, so that all of the pieces settle into their places. This is the story in full, gathered into a single quiet retelling. It began with the desert and the sun, and with a people who decided that the burning thing above them was not untouchable, but reachable. They built the sun disk at the heart of their capital, a device that could draw the power of the sun down into the world, and they used it to perform the ritual of Ascension. Through that ritual, chosen mortals were lifted into ascended beings. God warriors of immense power who often took the forms of beasts and who could not easily die. The unworthy were consumed by the attempt, but those who endured became the ascended host, the protectors of Shurima and the spearhead of its armies. Around these beings, the Empire grew into the greatest the world had ever known, and to those living inside it, the Golden Age felt permanent, blessed by the sun itself, beyond any power to end it. Then came the first great wound. A province called Icathia, chafing under Shuriman rule and knowing it could not win a fair war, reached for a weapon it could not control and opened a path to the void. The catastrophe that followed forced the Empire to send its god warriors into a conflict against an enemy that fought by no recognizable rules. And many of the Ascended were lost holding the void back. The Empire survived, but it was scarred, its belief in its own permanence shaken for the first time, and a darkness had entered the story that would never fully leave. Worse, the endless war had begun to do something to certain of the god warriors, a slow corruption that would soon produce a homegrown nightmare. That nightmare was the Darkin. Several of the Ascended, twisted by endless war and bloodshed into beings of pure cruelty, turned against everything around them, including their own kind. When they were finally defeated, they could not be killed, only bound, their hateful essences sealed inside living weapons, where they waited. The Empire that had learned to make gods had learned, without meaning to make monsters, and the line between the two had turned out to be terribly thin. And then came the fall, the heart of the whole history. The Emperor Azir, at the height of Shurima's power, chose to undergo Ascension himself, uniting in one person the authority of the Emperor and the power of a god warrior. His companion was Xerath, a man born a slave who had risen through brilliance to become a magus and the Emperor's friend, but whose hunger for a power that no one could ever strip away had never been satisfied. When Azir's plan to free the slaves threatened to make Xerath's elevation a gift rather than a conquest, Xerath chose betrayal. At the ritual, at the moment the power of the sun was at its peak, he seized it for himself. Azir was killed, the capital was destroyed, and the Empire sank beneath the sands in a single ruined afternoon. Xerath was transformed into a being of pure arcane energy, but the forces he tried to master bound him inside a stone sarcophagus, and there he remained, trapped, for thousands of years. What followed was the long silence. For an immense stretch of time, Shurima was a buried grave, its people reduced to scattered tribes and isolated cities who remembered almost nothing of what lay beneath them. Yet two fragile things survived the patient forgetting of the sand. Memory endured in the crystalline bodies of the bracken, and the royal blood of Azir endured, against all odds, in a single unknowing descendant named Severe, a mercenary who had no idea what she carried. The silence broke in the tomb of the emperors. Cassiopeia, a Noxian noble already cursed into serpentine form by an ancient Shuriman tomb, brought Severe into the depths in pursuit of power, and there she betrayed her, striking the mercenary down. But Severe's spilled royal blood was the missing piece the Empire had waited thousands of years to receive. The interrupted Ascension finally completed itself, and Azir rose, restored at last into the god warrior he was always meant to become. He healed the dying Severe, binding the ancient emperor and the modern mercenary together. The same rising shook loose Renekton, maddened by his endless imprisonment in that tomb, and freed Xerath from his long confinement. The emperor, the broken warrior, and the betrayer all returned to the world at nearly the same moment, and Azir began to raise the buried city back into the daylight. That is where the story stands now, with the Empire rising again, the living peoples of the desert pulled into its wake, the Darkin stirring, the brothers Nasus and Renekton locked in a grief neither of them chose, and the betrayer free once more to pursue the godhood that has always driven him. The grave has opened, and the rest of the story is still climbing out of the sand. There is one relationship in the rising of Shurima that deserves to be held up to the light on its own, because it carries a tenderness that the rest of this history, full of betrayal and madness and endless war, mostly lacks. It is the bond between Azir and Severe, the ancient emperor and the modern mercenary, and the more you sit with it, the more remarkable it becomes. Consider the distance between these two people. Azir died thousands of years ago, an emperor at the height of the greatest empire the world had ever known, a man who reached for godhood and was murdered at the threshold of it. Severe was born into a world that had long forgotten that empire, a battle mistress who made her living by her skill with a blade, with no knowledge that the last royal blood of Shurima ran through her. Everything separated them. Time, station, knowledge. The entire span of a buried civilization stood between the dead emperor and the living sellsword. By every reasonable measure, they should never have had anything to do with one. And yet the whole resurrection of Shurima turned on the meeting of their two lives in a single chamber beneath the sand. What makes it beautiful is the way they saved each other. Severe did not set out to resurrect an emperor. She was betrayed and struck down by Cassiopeia, left to die in the depths of a tomb, and it was her spilled blood, the royal blood she never knew she carried, that completed the ascension Azir had been denied for thousands of years. In her dying, without intending any of it, she gave the emperor his life back, and Azir, newly risen and possessed of power beyond anything in the modern world, used that power not for conquest or vengeance in that first moment, but to heal the dying woman whose blood had restored him. The heir saved the emperor, and the emperor saved the heir, each one giving life to the other in the same chamber across a gulf of thousands of years. There is something in that exchange that softens the whole harsh history of Shurima. So much of this story is about taking. Xerath took the power of the sun. Icathia tried to take a weapon it could not control. The Darkin took the form of pure cruelty. War took the nobility of the god warriors. And time took the memory of the empire. But the meeting of Azir and Severe is about giving. Severe gives her blood. unknowingly, and Azir gives her healing, deliberately, and out of that mutual giving the Empire begins to return. After thousands of years of a story driven by hunger and betrayal, the actual moment of resurrection turns on an act of grace. It also reframes what the rising of Shurima might mean. An emperor who returns full of nothing but the desire to reclaim what was stolen from him would be a frightening thing, a force of pure restoration with no room for the present. But the first thing Azir does upon rising is to preserve a life, to heal a descendant who was dying. That choice tells you that whatever Shurima becomes as it climbs back out of the sand, the Emperor at the center of it is not driven only by the desire to undo the past. He is a being capable of mercy, capable of recognizing the worth of a single life, even in the overwhelming moment of his own return. What that means for the future of the rising empire is not yet settled, but the seed of it is there in that first act. The Emperor choosing to give life rather than simply to reclaim power. The bond between Azir and Severe is, in the end, the thread of hope running through a history that could otherwise feel like an unbroken chain of loss. It says that even across thousands of years, even between people separated by everything, a connection can form that gives rather than takes. In a story so full of betrayal, the resurrection of Shurima turns out to rest on its opposite, on two people who, in their moment of greatest vulnerability, saved one another. When we began, I asked you to keep three forces in mind, three threads that keep returning throughout the history of Shurima, no matter how many centuries pass. The first was the sun and the strange power the Shurimans learned to draw from it. The second was the hunger for that power, the way it lifted ordinary mortals into gods, and then turned several of them into monsters. The third was betrayal, the quiet kind that grows inside friendship and trust. Now that we have followed the whole arc, it is worth seeing how completely those three threads explain everything that happened to the Desert Empire. The sun is where it all starts, and the sun is present at every turning point. It built the sun disk and made Ascension possible. It created the god warriors who defended the Empire and made Shurima the greatest power in the world. It was the prize that Azir reached for when he chose to ascend, and it was the power Xerath stole at the moment of betrayal. It buried the Empire when that power was unleashed unstably. And thousands of years later, it was the same ancient power, meeting Sivir's royal blood, that raised Azir from the dead and began to lift the city back out of the sand. From the first day to the present moment, the sun is the engine of the entire story. Every great event in Shurima is, at bottom, a story about what the sun's power can do, and what people are willing to risk to possess it. The hunger is the second thread, and it is the one that turns the sun's gift into a danger. The Shurimans did not simply use the sun's power. They wanted it, and the wanting never stopped. That hunger is visible in the priesthood standing guard over godhood, in the Icathians reaching for a weapon they could not control, in the Ascended pushed into endless war until some of them curdled into Darkin, in Cassiopeia venturing into a tomb in search of power and emerging cursed, and most of all in Xerath, the slave, who hungered for a power that no one could ever take from him. The hunger for the sun's gift is what corrupts and destroys throughout the history of Shurima. The power itself is neutral, a force drawn down from the sky, but the wanting of it bends people into shapes that ruin them and ruin everything around them. Shurima is in many ways a long meditation on what happens to those who hunger for godhood and find it within reach. The betrayal is the third thread, and it is the one that delivers the killing blow. Betrayal runs all through this story. Icathia betrayed the empire it belonged to. The Darkin betrayed the people they were created to protect. Cassiopeia betrayed Sivir in the depths of the tomb. But the betrayal that matters most, the one the entire history pivots around, is Xerath's betrayal of Azir. It was not the betrayal of an enemy, but of a friend, a man who had grown up beside the Emperor and stood at his side. And that is what made it lethal. The Empire could have weathered an attack from outside. It could not survive a knife held by the hand it trusted most. The fall of Shurima was an act of betrayal at its purest, the quiet poison growing inside friendship, and it brought down in an afternoon what the void itself had failed to destroy. Put the three threads together, and you have the complete shape of Shurima's history. The sun offered a power beyond anything in the hunger for that power drew people toward it and corrupted them as they reached. And betrayal, born of that hunger, brought the whole magnificent structure crashing down into the sand. Even the rising of the Empire follows the same pattern, because Azir returns through the same sun power that destroyed him, and the betrayer Xerath returns alongside him, still hungry, still dangerous, the third thread refusing to be cut. The story has not escaped its own forces. It has simply carried them forward into a new age. That is what makes Shurima such a satisfying world to spend time in. It is not a random collection of events. It is a history governed by a few deep forces that repeat and rhyme across thousands of years. The sun and the hunger and the betrayal turning over and over, producing glory and ruin in equal measure. Once you see those three threads, you can never unsee them, and every story the Desert Empire tells becomes another variation on the same profound. We have spent most of this history looking backward, tracing the Empire from its golden age through its fall and into the long silence. But the most unusual thing about Shurima, compared to the history of any finished civilization, is that its story does not end in the past. The Empire is rising again in the present day, and the road that leads out of the sand runs forward into territory that no one has yet seen. It is worth spending our last full chapter looking in that direction, at the uncertain future the rising Empire is climbing toward. Begin with the simple, staggering fact of the return itself. For thousands of years, Shurima was a settled matter. A buried empire and a scattered people and an unbroken silence. The world above had made its peace with the desert, treating the old empire as legend if it thought of it at all. And then, in the space of a single event beneath the tomb of the emperors, all of that certainty came undone. The emperor rose, the city began to climb back into the daylight, and a power the modern world had never truly believed in returned to the map of Runeterra. The road out of the sand begins with the world having to accept that something it considered dead and gone is alive again. And that kind of return changes everything around it. A buried empire is a story. A rising empire is a force, and forces reshape the world they enter. But the return is not a simple triumph, and this is where the future grows genuinely uncertain. Azir did not rise alone. The same moments that brought back the Emperor also loosed Renekton, maddened beyond reason by his endless imprisonment, and freed Xerath, the betrayer whose hunger for power destroyed the Empire the first time and remains undiminished by the age. The rising of Shurima is therefore not only the return of its glory, but the return of its oldest dangers, all of them waking at once. The Darkin are stirring in the deserts. The brothers Nasus and Renekton are locked in a grief that has no clean resolution, and the very being who brought the Empire down once before is free again, pursuing the same godhood that drove him to betrayal in the first place. The road out of the sand is crowded with the Empire's own ghosts, every one of them awake and moving. For the living peoples of the desert, this return is an enormous and unasked for change. The nomadic tribes, the isolated cities, the figures like Talia of the wandering tribes and Cassante of Nazuma, all of them built their lives in the long shadow of a buried empire that no longer threatened anyone because it no longer existed in any active sense. Now that empire is rising around them, and they have no choice but to reckon with what its return will mean for their own futures. Whether the rising Shurima becomes a restoration that lifts the desert peoples, or a force that overwhelms the lives they have built in the Empire's long absence, is a question with no settled answer, and the people of the present-day desert are living inside the uncertainty of it, caught between a glorious past that is climbing back into the light and a future that none of them can predict. And there is the deeper, quieter question that hangs over everything, the question of whether the rising empire can avoid the fate of the empire that fell. The history we have followed is, at its core, a warning about the three threads: the sun and the hunger and the betrayal. Shurima rose to unimaginable heights on the power of the sun, and it was the hunger for that power and the betrayal it produced that brought everything down. Now the Empire is rising again on that very same sun power, with the very same betrayer free in the world. The road out of the sand runs, whether anyone wishes it or not, right back through the same forces that destroyed Shurima the first time. Whether the rising empire can carry those forces without being consumed by them again is perhaps the single most important question the future holds, and it is one that the story has deliberately left open. That openness is not a flaw in the history of Shurima. It is the source of its life. A finished history can be admired, but it cannot surprise you. The history of Shurima is still being written, still climbing out of the sand, still capable of turning in directions no one expects. And that means the road out of the sand is a road that the people who love this world get to walk alongside the Empire, not knowing what waits around the next bend. The grave has opened, the Emperor has risen, and the rest of the journey is still ahead, somewhere out in the desert, waiting to be told. It would be a mistake to think of Shurima's history as something sealed inside the desert, a self-contained tragedy that played out in one region and stayed there. The truth is that the fall of Shurima sent its consequences rippling outward across all of Runeterra, and some of the most dangerous things loose in the wider world today can trace their origins back to the Desert Empire and the catastrophes it suffered. The reach of Shurima extends far beyond its own borders, and following those threads outward shows just how central this one empire is to the larger story of the world. Start with the Void, because the wound that Icathia opened did not stay in Icathia. When the rebellious province reached for a weapon it could not control and tore a path to the Void, it did not merely doom itself and threaten Shurima. It introduced into the world a hunger that has never been closed away, and the creatures born from that incursion have spread their menace far beyond the desert. The Devourers and the Watchers and the things that wear the shapes of nightmares, all of them connected to that ancient catastrophe, are now a threat to the whole of Runeterra rather than to Shurima alone. A single province's desperate gamble thousands of years ago created a danger that every part of the world now has reason to fear, and that is the long reach of Shurima at its most frightening. The Empire's wounds became the world's wounds. The Darkin are the second thread that carries Shurima's fall outward into the wider world, and they may be the clearest example of how the Empire's corruption scattered itself across distant lands. The Darkin were Shuriman in origin, ascended god warriors twisted by endless war into beings of pure cruelty. But once they were defeated and bound into living weapons, those weapons did not stay neatly in the desert. They were carried out into the world, and the conscious, hateful essences sealed inside them travelled with them. Aatrox, the world ender, bound within a sword, became a threat wherever that blade was taken up. Varus, surviving as a bow, became fused with two Ionian hunters named Valmar and Kai, which means a piece of Shurima's ancient corruption found its way into the distant land of Ionia and into the lives of two people who had nothing to do with the Desert Empire. Rast, the Darkin Scythe, became locked in a quiet war for control with a warrior named Kain. the two of them sharing a single body far from the sands where the Darkin were first made. The corruption of Shurima did not die with the Empire. It was scattered into weapons and carried across the world, where it continues to find new hosts and new victims. A poison from the desert, seeping into stories that seem, on the surface, to have nothing to do with Shurima at all. Even the betrayal at the heart of Shurima's fall has its echoes in the wider world, carried by people who came to the desert from elsewhere. Cassiopeia is the clearest example. She was not Shuriman. She came from Nasus, a daughter of the influential House de Couteau, a figure who belonged to a completely different part of Runeterra and its politics. It was her hunger for the power buried in the desert that drew her into a Shuriman tomb, where she was cursed into her serpentine form, and it was that same hunger that led her to betray Azir in the Tomb of the Emperors. Through Cassiopeia, the story of Shurima reaches into the affairs of Nasus and its noble houses, and the betrayal that nearly killed the last of Azir's bloodline was committed by an outsider whose ambitions had nothing to do with the Desert Empire until the Desert Empire's power tempted her. The reach of Shurima pulls in people from far beyond its borders, and it changes them, sometimes into monsters of an entirely different kind. And then there is Zelian, whose fate ties the catastrophe of Icathia to the wider experience of facing the void. His attempt to save his city from destruction, reaching for the magic of time itself and becoming unstuck in it, scattered across past and present and future, is a story that belongs to the moment Shurima's province opened the way to the void. A man who can see every moment but can no longer live in one of them is a living monument to the helplessness that the void inspired. And his existence carries the memory of that ancient disaster forward through all of time, into every age at once. When you stand back and take in all of these threads together, the true scale of Shurima's importance comes into focus. This was never just the story of one desert empire that rose and fell. The fall of Shurima seeded the wider world with dangers that are still active, still spreading, still threatening lands, and peoples who have no idea that their troubles began in the sands thousands of years ago. The void that menaces Runeterra, the Darkin corruption scattered into weapons across distant lands, the outsiders drawn to their ruin by the lure of the desert's power. All of it flows outward from Shurima. To understand Shurima is to understand one of the deep roots of the entire world, a single empire whose triumph and whose catastrophe sent consequences rolling outward in every direction. Consequences that the world is still living with today and will be living with for a long time to come. Of all the figures in the history of Shurima, there is one whose role is easy to underrate, because she spent almost her entire life with no idea how important she was. That figure is Azir, and before we close this story, it is worth giving her the attention she deserves, because without her, there is no rising of Shurima. The greatest emperor in the history of the world owes his return to a sellsword who never knew she was carrying a kingdom inside her veins. Azir was a battle mistress, a mercenary, someone who lived by skill and by force in a hard and practical world. She wielded a distinctive jeweled crossblade, and she made her way through life the way people in her line of work do, taking the jobs that came, surviving by being better at the work than the people around her. There was nothing in any of that to mark her as the last living thread of an ancient imperial bloodline. She did not carry herself like royalty, she did not live like royalty, and as far as the world could tell, she had no connection whatsoever to the buried empire sleeping beneath the desert sands. The royal blood of Azir, the lineage of the emperor who had reached for godhood and been murdered for it, had ended up in the hands of a woman who knew nothing about it, and would have had little reason to care if she had. There is a quiet poetry in that arrangement, and it is worth sitting with. For thousands of years, the Empire's hope of return depended on a bloodline that grew steadily thinner and more obscure, passing down through the generations until it survived in a single ordinary line. The fate of the greatest empire the world had ever known came to rest, without anyone intending it, on the shoulders of a mercenary who had never heard the full truth of where she came from. The key to undoing thousands of years of burial was not kept in a vault or guarded by priests. It walked around in the body of a working sellsword, hidden in plain sight, carried unknowingly through a world that had forgotten the empire it belonged to. What happened to Azir in the Tomb of the Emperors is the moment all of that hidden importance finally surfaced. And it surfaced through betrayal and near death, rather than through any grand recognition of her lineage. Cassiopeia brought her into the depths as a tool, betrayed her, and struck her down, and in that moment, Azir was simply a hired sword being discarded by an employer who had no further use for her. She did not march into that tomb knowing she would resurrect an emperor. She was led there, used, and left to die. And yet it was precisely her dying, the spilling of the royal blood she never knew she carried, that completed the Ascension Azir had been denied for thousands of years. Azir gave the empire back its emperor, not through any heroic choice, but through the blood that betrayal drew out of her, which makes her role both accidental and absolutely essential at the same time. The grace of her story is in what came after. Azir, restored to the power that had been stolen from him so long ago, used that power to heal the dying woman whose blood had brought him back. Azir did not end her story as a discarded tool bleeding out on ancient stone. She was saved by the very emperor she had unknowingly resurrected, the last of his bloodline pulled back from death by the founder of her own line. The mercenary who carried a kingdom without knowing it was rewarded, in the end, with her life given back to her by the emperor she had given life to first. Azir matters because she is the human scale of an enormous and ancient story. The history of Shurima is full of god warriors and emperors and beings of pure arcane energy, figures so vast that they can be hard to feel close to. Azir is none of those things. She is a person, a working mercenary caught up in something far larger than herself, carrying a weight she did not ask for and did not understand. Through her, the towering history of the Desert Empire touches an ordinary life, and the rising of Shurima becomes not just the return of a civilization, but the story of one woman who discovered in the worst moment of her life that she had been carrying the fate of a kingdom all along. This was the story of how the greatest empire Runeterra ever knew climbed into the light of the sun, vanished beneath the sand in a single moment of betrayal, and then, thousands of years later, rose again from its own tomb. We began with that premise, and now, having walked the whole long arc of it, we can see how completely the Empire's history holds together as a single tragedy and a single hope. It started with a people who reached for the sun and learned to draw its power into living flesh, building the sun disk and the ritual of Ascension, and the god warriors who made Shurima the most powerful civilization the world had ever seen. It carried through the first great wound of Acacia and the Void, the homegrown nightmare of the Darkin, and the endless wars that taught the Empire how thin the line really is between a god and a monster. And it pivoted, as the whole story always had to, on a single afternoon at the Sun Disk, where a slave-born magus named Xerath betrayed the emperor and friend who had reached for godhood, killing Azir, burying the capital, and sinking the empire beneath the desert in the span of one ruined ritual. Then came the silence, thousands of years of patient sand, broken at last by two fragile survivors of the empire's fall. Memory endured in the crystalline bracken, and the royal blood of Azir endured in a single unknowing descendant, the mercenary Azir. In the Tomb of the Emperors, a betrayal meant to end Azir's life instead spilled the blood that completed the Ascension stolen thousands of years before. And Azir rose, healed the dying heir who had restored him, and began to raise the buried city back into the daylight. The Emperor returned, and so did the maddened Renekton and the freed betrayer Xerath. The Empire's oldest glories and its oldest dangers waking together. Underneath all of it ran the three threads: the sun that offered a power beyond anything in the world, the hunger that drew people toward that power and corrupted them as they reached, and the betrayal, born of that hunger, that brought the magnificent Empire crashing down. Those three forces built Shurima, destroyed it, and now carry it forward into an uncertain future, because the rising Empire climbs back up on the same sun power that ruined it, with the same betrayer free in the world. The story has not escaped its own forces. It has only carried them into a new age, which is exactly why it remains so alive. That is the complete history of Shurima, as complete as it can be while the Empire is still climbing out of the sand. It is a story about reaching too high and paying for it, about the thin line between greatness and ruin, about a betrayal that took an afternoon and a silence that took thousands of years to break. But it is also in the meeting of Azir and Sivir, a story about grace surviving against every odd, about memory and blood refusing to be buried, and about an emperor whose first act upon returning was to give a life rather than to take one. The desert is patient, and the sand forgets almost everything. But the history of Shurima is the proof that some things are too deep to stay buried, and that even after thousands of years of silence, an empire can rise again, climbing back up toward the same sun that made it and unmade it, ready to begin its story once more.